Hey everybody, apologies for the mood lighting here in the hotel, but still some lessons learned that I have to uh, still some lessons I have to learn in terms of doing this from a hotel room. We're getting there, but thanks for joining me tonight. I thought uh, I thought I'd go through just some initial takeaways from the news conference at 1 o'clock or thereabouts this afternoon here at the Kennedy Space Center. The Let me know if you can see me and hear me reasonably. I think it's probably more important to hear what I'm saying than to see me. um, I was sitting right next to the crowd camera in the press room, and so uh, you've already. I think if you saw that, you've already seen enough of me for today. But um, let me let me so what I'm gonna need to do, and given what's happened here um, not that long ago, not less than 24 hours ago, obviously the plans changed. It wasn't maybe necessarily a complete surprise that that they've gone down this route, but um, today a lot in between getting things done, just about everybody who doesn't live here on the Space Coast, from the different space centers and the different contractors, everybody who'd already come down, and to some extent, we come down early for the wet dress rehearsal, but everybody who is here is basically, you're getting out of your hotel, you're um, trying to find a flight home as soon as possible, et cetera, et cetera. And so um, what I'm thinking here is I'll just run through my notes from the news conference, just sort of the initial takeaways of that, and then when I get home, I'm going to try and turn around a video here at the end of the week, like I normally do, and go back to that since we're going to be in this, we're going to be in a few weeks of a more normal pace of news. There will be probably a wet dress rehearsal in there somewhere, and the lead up to the next launch period will be a little different than this one. Um, okay, Paul says it's like, yeah, this the let me know. Let me see. Let me see if I can bump the volume up again. The It's when I was talking to the when I switched over to the NSF stream yesterday. I'm using the same headset, and they're like, "Yeah, we can fix it, no problem." um, but I'll go through the news conference in a little more detail when I get a chance when I get home. The There were some interesting little side notes and little tangents during the news conference, not necessarily focused on where they are and where they're going, but I think that's obviously the biggest. That was the biggest set of takeaways, was that, so really the most information we got was from Charlie Blackwell Thompson, the Artemis launch director, and she talked about a lot of things in answering questions too. But really, she talked about I'm going through my notes here. There were some things, again, some things that they got to see for the first time that worked well, um, and so even though there's a lot of work that's going to go into resolving the issues that they had last night, they also were able to check off some things that they were able to see for the first time. Like, one of the things that they wanted to see is they wanted to see the crew access arm retract in the terminal countdown sequence, because it has to come back within an allotted period of time. And then she didn't talk about extending it after a cutoff, but there's also probably there's a requirement and specifications there as well that they got to see. Um, and then she did also mention that the vehicle, they finished draining the vehicle early this morning, and they were getting into inerting, um, letting all the commodities boil off, and they'll inert the vehicle, and then that will allow the pad to be completely reopened for work. But I'm sure there are small crews out there already, not necessarily to get to work on resolving it, but just there's always a caretaking going on with the vehicle while it's at the pad in this configuration. So um, she talked obviously about she talked a little bit about what they saw in terms of the hydrogen concentrations, and she did actually kind of she 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 provided some color and answered a few of the questions that I had initially going in. She talked about the signatures were similar to Artemis 1, which is interesting. And she said, and they also talked about the fact that the upper limit for hydrogen concentration that you can measure from the hazardous gas detection system, they had increased the limit. They'd increased it in sort of steps. So they increased it during Artemis 1, and then they've increased it since then up to 16% is allowable based on the testing that they'd done earlier. They got they weren't comfortable going all the way to 16% for Artemis 1, but then they were able to do more testing. Um, but and then she said all the on the liquid oxygen side, again, they seem to have gotten the experience they need to load the core stage and the ICPS for that commodity. And so she said that the first violation was at 12:29 p.m. yesterday. Again, in that cavity between the flight side umbilical plate and the ground side umbilical plate, and then you have the quick disconnects going connecting between those plates. So they aren't able to provide a visual, but for electrical connections, it would be more like a not necessarily like a wall socket, but it'd be that kind of a plug. And for these, this is more of a a ceiling quick disconnect. So, and she talked a little bit about, they're going to look at the seals. I think again, this is something that just my opinion, just big picture, and I talked about this in the NSF stream yesterday, that there, 3 years between tanking, you lose some institutional experience. Maybe you keep the institutional knowledge, but it's different people. And I just think it would be valuable for them to do this more frequently than every 3 years. And that was a topic that was mentioned multiple times. Well, that's interesting. I wonder. I don't know that I've seen the stream drop off like that and then come back up again. So we'll see if they're having issues with that. It has been more stable, or maybe I haven't been checking it as much. That's probably also the case. But um, I'm trying to think if there were any. There's some other things that she noted. Some of the changes that they made that they were able to see for the first time in a full end-to-end propellant loading situation, like the new liquid hydrogen sphere, the change they made to the replenish valve on the liquid hydrogen skid. Again, it is a valve complex inside the base of the mobile launcher, so it's a different situation than the tail service mast umbilical cavity. And she said those changes worked well. But then one of the other things that she mentioned was, and one of the things we were wondering about in the countdown last night was, um, it was mentioned by Dr. Lori Glaze and by Charlie that they changed the Orion service module purge because um, they're concerned about um, the hazard from having a nitrogen purge going on near the white room during the crew ingress, and then during all the work that the closeout crew is doing to break down the white room and close the hatches and leave the crew at the pad at the pad. And um, it I didn't get a chance to follow up on this, but one of the things we noted last night was we got we heard that the closeout crew was given sort of the go to go out there, but there was a long pause or a long period of time where we sort of were anticipating we would see them at the pad surface, and we didn't. And we probably, we were sort of joking, well, maybe they're just driving slow, but I'm wondering if they needed to make that changeover from gaseous nitrogen back to air and then see that that was the case. So they can measure, they're measuring they're sampling the air in those areas. They typically will be looking for oxygen concentrations that are around a normal, 21% is what you should see typically. And so they probably wanted to see the area around the White Room closer to 21% and not zero when they're doing a nitrogen purge. So that was one of those things that was interesting. And but she said, she in talking about the going back to the hydrogen leak, she said one of the things that I asked her about, but she noted up front too, was that when they saw the hydrogen spike again in the terminal count, and when they get past T-6 minutes, they pressurize the liquid hydrogen tank, and she said the concentration came up pretty fast, and so that's why they held the count at T-5 minutes and 15 seconds, and basically that was they were done for the day at that point. So um, let me I sort of have that screen up here. The But yeah, there were definitely some interesting points there. I think that I think was one of the interesting takeaways to me. I was definitely surprised, and I think again this is just one of those things where I get the feeling that um, that when everybody touched base with where they felt they were going into this tanking test, that they got that sort of same sense of they 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 didn't sound they sounded like this was a situation that they were going to be um, they were going to be in, and that um, they don't have a good test setup to test this interface, um, aside from when you get a vehicle out to the pad. And there wasn't, again, unfortunately, again, I get the feeling because they cut the briefing off, I think either right at an hour or relatively short, considering there was a lot of interest in asking questions, and I ran up, figuratively ran up and was able to squeeze a couple of questions in to Charlie before they, she the public affairs people are helping make sure she gets to her next meeting. And so I'm kind of wondering if the post test briefing um, was scheduled for right there, which is unfortunate. But obviously she can't be in two places at once. But um, she I got the sense in listening to John Honeycutt, and again he's the chair of the mission management team right now, but he had been the SLS program manager on the NASA side for um, seems like a decade. So he has a lot of, pardon me, and he was in that position during Artemis One, so he's very familiar with what they did before Artemis One, and for a good deal of time after Artemis One, in terms of trying to understand the situation and trying to figure out some way to make adjustments to to the either to the way that they connect the plates or the alignment of the plates. I think that I think that I guess I was a little surprised at I got the sense that they probably could do more, but they aren't able to. I don't know how much. I don't know where the funding it goes within the programs, but um, I was curious. Again, these are some of the types of questions I would have asked. Again, the question that I asked in the live streams yesterday, which was, why didn't they opt to do an SLS only tanking test last year? Um, before Orion was stacked. But then ideally, since these vehicles are relatively scarce, you could they did an initial set of tests of the plates and the release and retract um, mechanisms for the umbilical arms, for the swing arms, and for the tail service mast umbilicals in the launch equipment test facility at Kennedy. And so I guess the issue is how high a fidelity test bed can they come up with? I'm sure given enough money, they could come up with a higher fidelity test bed than they have right now. I think one of the challenges in doing that is because hydrogen is so um, is so hazardous. I guess is the I don't know how else to describe it, but what seems to one of the things that Charlie talked about in the press conference is that they're not seeing the concentration spike until they go up to the fast fill flow rate. And again, I wonder if there were any changes to the way that they increased the flow rate. It is a slightly different configuration of the system than for Artemis 1. So um, that's it. If you were going to set up a test bed, then you would probably have to be able to move a considerable amount of liquid hydrogen through those both of those lines, the fill and drain line and the bleed line, in order to do a high fidelity test. I imagine that it would be possible to do, but it would probably be relatively expensive. But I mean, again, in my mind, um, how expensive is it to sit on the ground for an extra few months and some of the other things here? I mean, we're not talking about billions of dollars to wait for a month, but you have to wonder about um, you know trying to going after this problem more aggressively and with a little bit more money. But I mean, you could also say generically that's kind of the story of the issues in general, which is that you see, as I talk about all the time, you see industry much more in my mind much more aggressively tackle issues like this. And what that means is that they're not throwing money at it, but they're willing to commit more resources, money, and people to deal with issues because the most important thing to them is time. Generally speaking, again, it's a nice problem to have when you have that level of financial wherewithal. Like so again, people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos who want to do this, they have the ability to um, selectively, but tackle some of these issues more aggressively than you would see NASA do. And so I'm left wondering whether, given a reasonable increase in resources, this that they could do a better job of testing this, or maybe better job's the wrong way of putting it, but that they could create a much more again, I'm exaggerating, but they could have a higher fidelity test bed. I think obviously the question would be how expensive is it and how valuable is it to the program. Um, but we will see, like because there will be implications from this if this mission continues to slide towards the spring. There at least could be implications given that we don't know the other things going on about that. Let me see, and let me see if there were any other notes. I guess there were a couple things that they heard that I guess weren't necessarily Artemis II. There are obviously other things going on, but and I'll just note, um, well, so Amit Kshatriya, the associate administrator for NASA, he used to be the head of the exploration directorate, but he in one of the questions about Artemis III, um, sort of casually mentioned, but it was still interesting. He casually mentioned that the Artemis III core stage 3, that the upper four elements of the stage that are still in New Orleans at Michoud, that they expect to transport that in the next couple of months. That's was useful to hear just because it at least suggests that that final mate with the engine section in Florida is still they're still looking at that in the in the spring time frame. So that I thought was interesting. And he also talked about the Artemis III Orion. He said that I think he said both of the um, both of the modules, the Orion crew module and the Orion service module. I can't remember. I think the integrated tests that they do with those with those elements are there's a thermal test, and then I mean, these are just the big tests that we know about. Obviously, they're doing work on them, every day. But there's a thermal test of both of each of the modules, and they have different flows. And then there's a direct field acoustic test, like we just heard Blue Origin do on their first Mark I spacecraft in Florida. um, and I think in between the thermal test and the direct field acoustic test for the crew module is where the heat shield would be attached. And he didn't mention where the heat shield was, but that's probably where things stand right now for the Artemis III crew module. But he also then said they're getting pretty close to being mated. Again, he might be. I mean, he might think in his mind or big picture, if that happened in July, which is still several months away, that would still be, that's still relatively soon. We didn't get a chance to follow up on that, but um, and one of the consequences of things going down the way they went down with the wet dress rehearsal and everybody basically leaving town as soon as possible is um, I'm not going to get the opportunity to talk to anybody about what's going on here at Kennedy Space Center about SLS production, about Orion production. And so I don't know. I think, unfortunately, they really don't. Well, that's not fair. I think just logistically, it's going to be easier for them to just wait until right before Artemis II to talk about all of this stuff. Um, whereas I would have been fine with staying a couple of extra days if we could grab people, but the problem is a lot of the communications and public affairs people for the contractors and for NASA, um, they're all going home too. And so unfortunately, that'll have to wait about a month. So is what I'm guessing. But I also will, I will try and follow up with, I will be trying to follow up with Orion and SLS when I get home, probably next week after we kind of get through all of this stuff. So, um, and then just one other thing being, again, as I said, um, I went up as soon as they cut out of the press conference. What I asked Charlie about was what's the sequence of steps for from here to the next launch window, which is launch period 18 that opens on March 6th, because I just wanted to get a sense of where would they do some things before the next wet dress rehearsal, or would they do them after? And they mentioned during the press conference they're still working out that schedule, so they don't have anything definite. But I wanted to get a feel for, as much as possible, do you have to do the flight termination system retest um, close to the launch period, um, or would you prefer to do that, and which would imply that they would do it after the wet dress rehearsal, the next one, or can you do it anywhere and you could do it before? Um, and I mean, she didn't have any set answers, but it sounds like um, what she did say was that the timing of the flight termination system retest will be driven by the March 6th date, that opening of the opportunity. Um, and so it would, I think if they're going to try and get back into a test configuration, then probably you might see the wet dress rehearsal first. But I guess one of the good things, if we have this camera feed here, is that we should be able to see that relatively. We should at least be able to see the platforms lifted into place. We won't necessarily be able to see a lot of work once it happens, because they'll actually be positioned behind this view. But and then I also did ask about the countdown demonstration test, the part two, which is really, again, just a walkthrough with the crew at the pad. And that's just one of those things where they'll find time to do that. But right now, what it sounds like they're going to do is they're going to, and they I think said it explicitly in the press conferences, they're going to set up work stands around the liquid hydrogen uh, tail service mast umbilical. They're going to demate the plates. They're going to look at the seals. They're so some of the things that we talked about this morning that would make sense and that they've done before. So, and one of the things that they did mention in the briefing is they think it's possible that they got some FOD, some foreign object debris. It doesn't really take much to create the leak path. So it's possible that so. But I think I don't know that I don't know that we'll necessarily hear any results taking seals and looking at them under a microscope, but they will be able to they will be able to they will change the seals, do any refreshes they need, remate the plates. They'll have to do some if you remember, let's see, when would this be? This would be back in the sort of in the late spring, early summer when SLS was stacked, when it was lifted and made it to the boosters. And I remember talking about interface verification tests. So what they'll need to do is they'll need to run the specific set of tests for that umbilical plate again, just to verify that the connections are working. And then in theory, they would try and get the vehicle back into a test configuration. And we'll just have to see whether they choose to do the retest, the flight termination system retest. But I think when I get home, I will have longer time to just take a look at those two limits, the 28 days and the 35 days, and see when they could do that test. What's the earliest they could do that test? And that really tells you how much flexibility they'll have in their schedules to do that. Because in this case, they're not trying to get out to the pad, and they don't have to do all of this extra work with, closing out volumes, retracting platforms. They just have to do this retest at the pad, and they have the wet dress rehearsal, another wet dress rehearsal that they need to do. So, um, so I, so that's kind of those were kind of my takeaways. Is there, I think the highest priority is to disassemble the tail service mast umbilical plates, make repairs. So replace anything that needs any gaskets or anything like that need to be replaced, remate them, redo the interface verification test, and then that will lead into getting ready to do another wet dress rehearsal. And they said, you know, I think sort of jokingly said, maybe if you come back tomorrow, which again, if they were serious about that, we would all stayed and come back tomorrow. But hopefully we will know better by, either the end of this week or maybe this time next week, what they're looking at in terms of doing the next wet dress rehearsal. And, that's an obvious question now, which is, what if you go do that? What if you go do that test again and you get and you have mixed results? So somebody after the briefing asked, would you consider doing it sooner so that you maybe had a chance to do another one? So we will see where they end up on the calendar with the wet dress rehearsal, and then obviously we'll be looking to see what happens. So let me go back here. There was quite a bit of data in there, and so let me see if there are any questions in here. And I think so the thoughts on the next date. I think it depends on how they want to organize the schedule. They should be able to work on Orion somewhat independently of this until they get right up to they're going to do another 2-day long countdown. What else do they want to do before they perform another test? I'm trying to think, because I think I brought this up one of these streams, which was you're sort of in the same time of this month as you were again back in that September 2022 situation, where they basically ended up doing exactly the same thing. I think at the time, so they had the I think the second attempt that they had the leak on, and that they scrubbed and basically went into this um, general plan of attack, I guess. I think they talked about being ready to do another wet dress rehearsal or a tanking test in that case within a couple of weeks, and I think they ended up. I think the date sort of moved around a little bit because they were also talking about doing more software changes at the time. So depending on how much um, when they have to do software changes, then they need to validate those. So they'll run them in a test lab at the Kennedy. I think it's in firing room 3, I want to say. So they'll run through some simulations. They'll run through um, like futzing with the parameters, trying to break it and make sure that the changes still work correctly, and regression testing, etc. If they don't have to do that, then it's possible that we might be looking at maybe in a couple of weeks. But hopefully we'll get a much better idea about that. And also, to be fair, that's the first time that they took that umbilical apart at the pad was in September. They um, they've at least gone through this process recently, and so they did it last year. So hopefully, maybe they'll be able to get back ready to test in maybe a little bit sooner. But I still think we're probably talking about a week and a half, 2 weeks would be sort of the a gross estimate about when they would be ready. But the other thing that I remember was like they got into that process of doing the repairs, demating the umbilical plates and repairing the sealing surfaces, um, within a couple of days. And so um, I'm trying to remember if I think so. I think that the date of the scrub in Artemis 1, like they scrubbed with the hydrogen leak on like September 3rd, and I think they ended up performing the test on September 9th. That was a tanking test, but you're still set up the same way. They performed it on September 19th, so it sort of ended up being again in that sort of 2 week time frame. So we'll see whether they're able to pull it in a little bit more than that. But that's kind of what I would expect to see, and maybe at this point, then they'll find a place in the schedule where they can do that countdown demonstration test part 2 with the crew. Um, but and so the crew is now going to end up going back, and the training team and the flight crew will end up probably doing some additional simulations. Even though they're ready, they will probably do some refresher simulations. Um, and then eventually they'll go back into quarantine a couple of weeks before again, because I think this is not a leap year, so the 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 days of the week and where the dates fall on the calendar in February and March are essentially exactly the same until you get to March 29th. So they went into quarantine on January 23rd. If they were going to set up for launch period 18, they would go back into quarantine on February 23rd, um, which is a little bit less than 3 weeks from now, but in that ballpark. So they have a little bit of time here. Um, but let me see if there were. So yeah, and so one of the things I found, somebody's mentioning here about hotel reservations. Um, the There was a little bit of the feedback loop for the changes in the dates. So we went, in the last week we went from February 6th to February 8th, and now March 6th. And so that 48-hour delay, when I got here, there were a lot of reservations that most of the rooms here were already booked. I was hoping to be able to extend, and I was able to eventually, but it took a little while. And again, if you have the if you have reservations that you can cancel with no penalties, usually you can go up to 48 hours or sometimes 24 hours before your reservation before you cancel them. But I think at this point, now that there's more clarity about it's not happening in February, we will see. Um, you will, you'll suddenly probably be able to get some rooms here this coming weekend and into next week. But um, and and the other interesting thing is today the temperature, like when I got back to the hotel, it was in the 60s. It feels um, it feels completely different now, compared to, I mean, even just last night when I got back in the car, uh, after they finished, ended the test for the day. It was already back down to freezing, and it had actually been colder than that a couple of days ago. And that actually reminds me, one of the questions that Charlie was asked again, was why they didn't go on Saturday. And I thought that was interesting because that was something that I was wondering about. Was she talked about the cold temperatures and that they did have some issues with that, but they were pretty decently prepared for that. The problem that, but she said the winds that were forecast for Saturday were a bigger problem than the cold temperatures in that scenario, because she was talking again, I think she said they measured, because they're measured at, above ground level. I think she said they recorded a 50 knot wind gust. I think it was wind gust, but again, she said that's just too high for them to. You don't want to put propellant on the vehicle in that situation, or have propellant on the vehicle in that situation. So the so I did think that was interesting too. Um, so the Julian's talking about, Amit talking about again that they don't have they don't have a good feel for the dynamics of the, uh, what that does to those umbilical plate connections, and it's possible that you have that same issue with the other umbilical plates. It's just that umbilical plate is going to be the most sensitive to, um, to those motions during rollout. Um, Even they have other hydrogen lines, but if the so for instance they vent the boil off up through the, core stage intertank umbilical, but you're talking there about gaseous boil off um, versus liquid hydrogen going through there, and obviously the flow rate, the gaseous flow rate up there at the top of the tank is different than the flow rate for the liquid hydrogen going into the fill and drain valve, and then going through and then coming out through the bleed line at different points in the countdown. And the question that I asked, I was trying to get some sense of whether they were able to distinguish between, because that had been something they talked about back in Artemis 1, distinguishing between issues going through one of the lines, going through both of the lines, being able to characterize, like, that they were, which, if one of the lines was having an issue, or if both of the lines were having issues with sealing. And the answer she gave, I think what she ended up saying was essentially, we need to take a look at the data more closely. But that may also be something that's going to feed into what do they do. They disconnect the plates, and they service the connections, but they may also want to have that data review have reached a certain level of maturity before they remate them, because they may want to do some extra work on alignment, or, um, take a look at some additional things if they think it was one of the lines more than the other. Um, but that I did think that her answer was interesting, but I think she was also saying, it's only been, at the time that they did the, news conference. I think it had only been about 12 hours since they'd called it a day. So, um, there is still, hopefully we will get, I'm pretty sure we're going to be bugging people to, to give us updates, tomorrow. And, so, but if not, then Thursday. But we'll just have to see we'll have to see what we get. I think ultimately what you would want is at least to know where they are at the end of this week, and then, sort of early next week, where are they? So hopefully we'll see where they are after another day of looking at the data. The so, yeah, I think, there obviously there's been some comments today, as you would expect, um, sort of looking at the big picture and looking again at these same questions that we've been talking about, or I've been talking about, and everybody else has been talking about for years, about um, there a lot of people, and you understandably, I would say, are not satisfied with what's going on with SLS. I think, um, not necessarily wanting to cancel it, but I think I would put myself in the camp of, I do think it would be, if the program could increase their flight rate, I do think that they would get the experience, they would get some added experience, and they would that experience would help them get to a point where they weren't seeing these types of issues, um, for every launch flow. So that's, that's, um, but again, you have this, what do you call it, tribalism, and so there's more to it than that. I think in general, I think the and so I think probably the best way to put it is I'll probably address that in the next video. It won't be the first time I've addressed that, because you're just basically being reminded of, um, you have issues with this system. All systems have their own set of issues, and I think that the tribalism part comes into it, where, I think some people think, that when you have problems with when you have issues with one system, that changes, it might change the way you look at the other systems, but I'm not of the opinion that it really changes the realities for anything else. So again, you could flip this on its head. I don't think this necessarily improves, uh, it doesn't improve or hurt Starship or Blue Origin. Um, and you say the same thing. So for instance, the hiccups that Starship had early last year, you could certainly, I don't see how you could say that improved the SLS situation. I don't think it changed it at all. I don't think it had any effect on the situation with SLS, and just as I don't think that the SLS situation has any effect on Starship or Blue Moon. So we basically are still in this situation where we have a crew rated system that is close to being ready to fly, but obviously not ready to fly next week. That doesn't fly often enough for, I think, everybody's satisfaction. But the problem is that the other systems that are being designed to fly much more often than this, aren't ready to go to the moon. And so, um, what I call that is you've got two halves that don't make a whole. There is no whole yet. There is no end-to-end lunar landing system, that where you fly crews, even if you're doing this relay race for Artemis III, where you launch the crews on Orion and SLS, and then they get in Starship and they go down and they land on the moon, and then they come back and do that in reverse. That's kind of like a relay race, but, um, we're not quite there in terms of going to the moon. We're closer with Orion and SLS, but then, once you fly the system, how soon can you fly the next one? But then the problem is that we don't have the anchor leg of the relay race, either Blue Origin or Starship yet. So, um, so I think now you've got the global question of when is when is this vehicle going to be ready to fly, and obviously but you still have the other questions for Artemis 3. You still have the questions about when's the lunar lander going to be ready to fly, and as I said, I don't think this I don't think this affects or changes the situations for anybody else, um, at all. It doesn't. It what it can do is it can change people's perceptions at some point, and that obviously could be hugely important. But I think that the problem is there is no, um, consensus answer. There's no, well, just do that. That's a better system. Go with that. It. I think the problem is that that system will be better when it's functioning, when it is available. So we have this issue of we're waiting for the commercial providers to get their systems operational, and we've seen, for instance, so even Starship in a prototype form, they've um, they've worked really hard and iterated a lot on making that system. You can't say it's easy to launch, but it's a system that they've already gotten relatively proficient when they have the hardware to launch it. And so they've already launched it almost a dozen times in basically in the time span between since Artemis One flew. So, but the problem is that it's not ready to go to the moon, and we don't know when it's going to be ready to go to the moon. So, it's but yeah, that's not going. That argument is not going anywhere. At least not for the next few years. So, but I and so this is just going to bring it up again. Um, so it's always going to be sort of sitting in the background, and no matter even if Artemis II flies and it's a successful flight and it's clean, we'll come back to that at some point. We just came back to it today. But we even if it dies off for a little while, it'll just keep coming back for the next, certainly for the rest of this decade. So, plenty of time to talk about that. Let's see. Was the umbilical the only leak? I I I believe so. At least the only that was the showstopper. I think um, I'd say the big showstopper. I don't know. They had issues with Orion. They mentioned those, but I don't think in terms of what they talked about in the briefing. Um, if I think if they had had the hiccups in the processing that they did in the closeout in the White Room, if those were showstoppers, I think they would have talked about them a little differently. I don't think that that was necessarily a showstopper to making a launch attempt on either Sunday or Monday, at least being ready to do that. The showstopper was this leak in the liquid hydrogen tail service mast umbilical. So, and I don't recall hearing any other issues that were that serious. But obviously, this is serious enough by itself. So, um, they did talk about that. I think they'll probably have to reevaluate if they get to the point where they get all the way through March and they're still on the ground. They'll obviously be talking about that. But I think the 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 current outlook is that if they can't launch the vehicle in March, then they're probably looking at the much more likely, but not guaranteed, but they're much more likely to be looking at rolling back if they can't launch by mid March, basically. So um, that's let's see if there is. And then they talked a little bit about how far along the next SLS rocket is. Again, the to me, just because I'm I have not heard the status of the engine section in a long time. They talked about the other parts of the stage. The third SLS core stage needs to be finished, and Orion needs to be finished, and the rest of the next vehicle otherwise is basically in storage, waiting to be stacked. So that's the solid rocket boosters, the RS-25 engines, the ICPS upper stage, the connectors basically are ready to go for Artemis III. But these are the two pieces that we're talking about now in some detail in terms of these are the last pieces that they need to um, finish testing for Artemis II, are the core stage and the Orion. And so um, I think based on what I heard today, I think it's at least still, it might be optimistic, but it does sound like it's still feasible for them to finish, to have the next vehicle, all the pieces of the next vehicle done um, around, by the end of this year. And then that would mean if you look at the how things went with Artemis 2, it took them about a year to get to start from starting to stack the vehicle to the point where they rolled out and were ready to do at least a wet dress rehearsal. It took them about a year. So if that was the case and they were ready, early or late 26, early 27, then that would mean that that hardware could probably fly as soon as um, end of 27, early 28. Uh, Obviously, if we knew a little bit with a little more fidelity, schedule wise, when exactly those pieces were going to be done, then maybe you could move that readiness date up. But I mean, again, you're still going to have the conversation about um, where is the next vehicle? Where's the fourth vehicle, the fourth Orion and fourth SLS? Because if you really want to fly the third one, then you have to make the choice of um, I'm sure they could find a mission to fly the third one besides a lunar landing, but if the goal again you have to what's the priority? If the goal is the lunar landing, then you wait for the lunar lander. If it's important enough to continue flying and increase the launch cadence, then you have to have another vehicle ready. What you have to have another vehicle ready when the lunar lander is ready. And of course, there's the huge mystery of when the lunar lander is going to be ready. Unfortunately, that remains this it's all shrouded in secrecy, and it basically remains it's the biggest mystery in Artemis the whole time I've been doing this YouTube channel. So I mean, we're already for 2 years. It's the biggest mystery of Artemis for now. So we will see about that. Or well, we'll see it one way or another. It's this sort of the same thing with this wet dress rehearsal that just happened. You think you think that you make a guess about where they are in terms of do you think they're going to have a clean wet dress rehearsal, but then you do the wet dress rehearsal and you see it tells you it tells you it tells you what the reality is. So um, we should get some of that when we start to see uh, the Mark One Blue Moon lander when that flies, and we start to see the next version of Starship begin flying here, hopefully in the next couple of months. So, um, but we they could they could share more, but so far they have not, and so we'll just have to see. We're just going to have to see what we can see, just like we have for the last couple of years. Um, I That's a good question about who's hands on the surfaces. I mean, the thing is that Jacobs is now called well, or it was bought by Amentum, so that's the name of the company, and that's the Comet contract, and it's I think consolidated, but they're basically the prime contractor for Kennedy for exploration ground systems, launch processing and landing and recovery. So it would be Amentum probably who has the hands on doing that, but again, this is a NASA vehicle, NASA blueprints, NASA specs, NASA procedures, obviously in consultation with the people that are doing the work, but they're just doing, assuming that the quality control inspectors are there watching, they're following the procedures as written. So it's more of an institutional. The institution needs to um, needs to learn enough more lessons to where you get to the point where you don't have to worry about this so much. It's probably going to be a while. And again, another one of those questions that seems relevant now, which is would they consider doing a tanking test of the next vehicle? Would they put in some extra time and just do a tanking test of the SLS before they stack Orion? That'll be in a different situation. But would they consider doing? I don't think they were considering doing a tanking test of the Artemis III vehicle, um, and there will be other factors involved. But to me, that's an obvious question that you would ask, um, regardless of what other issues you have and whether they have a clean, whether they launch in March with this vehicle. I think you're still going to be wondering what happens with the next vehicle. So. Um, we don't know. Yeah, we don't know. We're they need to figure out what they want to do when they disconnect the umbilical plates and do the servicing and maintenance on them. And so they need to take a look at the data and the data, maybe if they taking a closer look at the data, they were talking about, they thought maybe it had to do with uh, foreign object debris, or maybe alignment issues, or maybe a combination of those. But it'll just depend on what they want to do once they have the plates disassembled. Is there anything they want to do besides just the regular, um, you know, remove or repair, or not remove and replace the sealing surfaces? Get new, get new seals, install those, remate the plates, retest, and then get back into a countdown configuration. Um, and so I think they said, at the least at the briefing, they said, um, let us take a look at it. Maybe we'll try and come back tomorrow and let you know where we are. I think probably more realistically would be by the end of the week. Certainly, I think if we don't hear anything, if we get to Friday and we haven't heard anything, there will be people bugging them to at least tell us where they are. Um, so, but I mean, sort of a wild guess at this point, I think would be a couple of weeks. If you looked at what happened with Artemis One, they had a hydrogen leak on the second launch attempt early in September 2022, and then they did a tanking test about 2 weeks later. I think ended up being 16 days, but it may be possible that they can do it faster than that. Um, Although I don't know that they can do it a whole lot faster than that, but maybe they can do it more like 2 weeks, maybe a little under 2 weeks. But they were not willing to say at this point, so we have to wait. We have to wait a couple of days, I think, at least, to find out, for them to at least give us a ballpark guesstimate about where they're looking to do that test. Um, yeah, I mean, if I think, um, I know the NSF folks are definitely um, excited about the next Starship launch. So if it is March 9th, I mean, that would actually be right in the middle. I think they won't be quite as excited if those launches ended up right on top of each other. If you had sort of, not necessarily a scheduling conflict, but just like everybody else, um, those folks can't be in two places at once. And there were a lot of people who came back to the Cape, to cover the wet dress rehearsal, and we're getting ready to cover the Artemis II launch. And so that would be a probably somewhat of a logistical challenge for some of the broadcast organizations that live stream from Starbase, but also obviously cover Artemis missions when they happen. So we will see we'll see if those end up, pardon me, coinciding. But that is obviously going to be, that's a big deal for Artemis. Both of those missions are big deals independently of each other. So that it'll be, that is going to be, those will both be sort of must watch launches, whenever they occur. And I think it's more likely that they will naturally deconflict from each other. And so we'll just have to see how that goes. Um, And so, yeah, and again, maybe, so of course, this probably also pushes back the whole conversation about what they're thinking about doing, um, after Artemis 2 for another month. Now, I did see somebody mentioning a hearing in either the House or the Senate, and so I may need to go look that up, because if 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 they ask for if they ask NASA to give them their thoughts on on what's happening after Artemis 2, then we should get we should get at least something to chew on here in relatively soon. So I'll have to go look and see, what they're talking about, because anytime they talk to Congress at this point, it's going to be interesting, because they're, um, big picture, they have differences of opinion about how to go about the future, of Artemis, and so it's going to be interesting to see every year how they compromise. Um, so that'll be. we'll have to see how that goes. The let's see. So yeah, in terms of uh, we might the next wet dress rehearsal will not be this week. I I'm not sure exactly what a no earlier than date was. What I'm talking about at the end of this week is um, we might get an estimate. We might get a date that they're thinking about for when they're going to do the next wet dress rehearsal. Um, but that might be optimistic too. But again, we need to. But we're this is my job, which is to follow follow each step and ask them where they are now and what's the next step. What's the overall roadmap look like? Um, and so I think by the end of this week, it's possible that they'll give us an idea. I mean, but they may also say mid February, which is, I guess it's a little helpful, but it's not completely specific. But I guess within the narrow big picture of Artemis II, so to speak, um, if you remember, because they were when they rolled out in mid January, um, they there was still just enough time with a few days of margin to do a wet dress rehearsal in front of the launch window that they've now passed up. But I mean, they only had a few days of play of margin between when they could do the wet dress rehearsal and and then turn around and be ready to launch. And so if they're able to do a wet dress rehearsal in mid February, or let's say in about 2 weeks, that would then give them a little more than 2 weeks between the wet dress rehearsal and the first launch attempt. So they would, if that were to come to pass, then they'd have a little bit more time to take a look, make some adjustments. So some of the other things that weren't necessarily showstoppers from yesterday, they would have time to address, like some of the Orion issues. They talked about some communications issues, although when they were asked about that, they said that had actually already been resolved. I'm going to be curious to see uh, if there are any cold temps or other weather issues, because we will go from the we'll go from winter weather issues, although this is an infrequent event in Florida to get this cold, but then severe weather, spring weather, that transition from winter to spring, that's more um, typical. They will see severe weather in the spring here in Florida, and then obviously they don't want to get out into the hurricane season, but eventually you'll get into that area if you get closer to the middle of the year. Um, so I think we'll see what happens in terms of uh, if there are any weather challenges in for the next wet dress rehearsal. But even then, 2 days wouldn't be as big of an issue in mid February as they would if you just had the same setup as we just did. So if they got to the end of February without doing a wet dress rehearsal, then you would be in that same situation where they'd be running out of time to do the test and then deal with any issues that aren't necessarily showstoppers, but they need to address them before they get into the launch count. So in theory, you have some time to assess what happens in this next test, but it isn't a whole lot of time because this leak that they just had yesterday is going to take them a good deal of time to they're going to spend a couple of weeks with repairs, and then they're going to and perhaps maybe it'll be within the 2 weeks they'll do the repairs and get set up to do another test, but that's still a long time. So again, that question came up after the news conference, and it's a fairly obvious question, which is what happens if you go and do the next test, and you know you have a leak. Maybe it's not quite as bad, or but you still have a leak. And so, then is there enough time to do another test before you get into the next window? So we'll see. I think um, we'll just have to see what they do. I think certainly, well, I'm certainly hoping because things are not so compressed for the next test that they will do a briefing before the next test and talk in more detail about what measures they've taken to try and mitigate the issues that they saw last night. So um, let's see if there are any questions. I saw some questions. I just wanted to see if there was anything else here. Um, how do I think the wet dress rehearsal went? I mean, I think the problem is that yes, they were able to check off a lot of boxes, and so they did they 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 sort of completed verification of several of the upgrades that they made. So they talked about the crew access arm. They talked about the second liquid hydrogen sphere. Charlie Blackwell Thompson called it the loading sphere. Um, so yeah, they checked off a lot of those boxes, and so those are done, so to speak. But when you find a showstopper, that's not good. So that's I think unfortunately that kind of hangs over all of the wins that they were going to get in the test. Um, is that you're not looking? I don't think they were looking to find a showstopper last night. Certainly not going into it. And it did sound like they were. Um, it sort of sounded like I got the sense that I ended up having sort of the same reaction that they did, which is they were surprised but not totally surprised, or it's like they knew that there was a risk to this, but they weren't necessarily expecting to see a leak. Um, I mean, I could be wrong. That was just my sense of listening to the way that they spoke about it today. I think that the bigger surprise to me was that it just didn't sound like they didn't sound confident that they had the resources to just tackle this, that and make this a high priority um, problem for the overall either the directorate or the program to deal with. And so that makes me wonder whether they're going to this is going to be a question mark going into every launch campaign for the time being. I think Eric Berger asked a question along those lines in the news conference and saying, this is just going to be an experimental vehicle for the foreseeable future. But I mean, I just think I don't know that it's a desirable situation to be in, going into every single launch campaign wondering when you tank the vehicle for the first time if it's going to leak. So pardon me. Let me see. um, that's interesting. I'll have to see what uh, at some point, because I know EJ is EJ does at least does the Friday afternoon um, live stream for NSF. So I'll have to see what he says on Friday. Although I won't be able to see it live because that's usually week on during the week. Friday is the day that I'm recording and editing heavily, into video production. So we'll just have to see. But that's interesting. Um, so yeah, I don't know what I'm not sure what issues he had. I mean, to me, the biggest issue I had with the press conference was just um, the inability to ask multiple follow-ups. I had it was just it was just too short in my opinion. I think um, there are circumstances. Obviously, there are extenuating circumstances. Again, it was very short. It was very shortly after the test had been completed. Just about everybody, I think, in the room was working on short sleep, including Charlie Blackwell Thompson and Ahmed and all of the people up on the podium, including the public affairs officer. So Rachel Kraft, um, she's the one who put out, or she's the one who put together. I mean, obviously it's a team, the public affairs team, but I mean, you know, I went home and I think I was asleep before they published that, and they were up before I was on Monday, and went, and didn't call it a day until after that. So everybody was working on short sleep. Having said that, um, this was too short if it was going to be the only opportunity, and I just did not get the sense if they had said, "Hey, we'll do another one of these on Wednesday," um, and it would be kind of a shame to me if they do that because I'm going home tomorrow. So I would have liked. It didn't have to be today, but I would have liked the opportunity to follow up on some of the things they talked about in the news conference. But I don't know that that necessarily means I had an issue with anything they said, just that just we did not get the opportunity to better understand some of their uh, to better understand kind of where they were historically. Again, those questions about what are the pros and cons of doing a tanking test last year versus doing it now. We really haven't had a chance to go into that because it's just not as interesting of a question as it is the next press conference. If it's 2 weeks before the next wet dress rehearsal, I I'm gonna have I'm gonna always have probably like 5 questions that are talking about the here and now, and you just don't get an opportunity to ask some of these other questions typically. So anyway, that would be that. But to me, I don't know that I don't necessarily have an issue with. I can't think of it having an issue with anything that they said in the news conference, other than maybe, just not having enough information to say anything. But yeah, that's it's a to me that's a different criticism than. But again, like I said, I don't know what EJ was what his criticism was. So um, yeah, I mean, I think they so yeah, I mean, I certainly would have been more interested in the opportunity to follow up more. And there, hopefully, there will be some opportunity to do that. I'm just not exactly sure what forum will get to do that. If it's going to be written questions, it's always valuable to be able to speak directly um, to the subject matter experts. It's still my responsibility to try and come up with, to ask good questions or relevant questions or both. But uh, you have less of a possibility of something getting lost in translation when you get to ask the question directly. And so, but yeah, it's typically, uh, I think I imagine some of the other. I spoke with one reporter right after this, and I think we both were wishing that we would have gotten an extended opportunity to cover more of the ground that to just follow up and dig a little deeper into some of the ground that they covered during the news conference. But to be fair, that's, I think, kind of a general opinion, I think, of this. There's never enough time, and I always say to them, I'm always going to run out of time before I run out of questions. So, um, but yeah, I obviously would hope we get additional opportunities. Um, but this was kind of weird because, again, just again, sort of logistics here. Most of the subject matter experts from the programs, maybe I mentioned this at the top, a lot of people were not going to come in for the launch until tomorrow, Wednesday. And even Wednesday was a little early for a Sunday night launch. Some people were going to come in Wednesday, some were probably going to come in as late as Friday. And so, because, uh, because this since you can cancel reservations without any financial penalties, um, since they got a heads up, what is it, 2 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, 2 o'clock in the morning today, that they weren't going to fly in February. Um, that was the beginning of the travel, cancellation of travel reservations. And so I think basically what ended up happening is those people who were planning to travel to come down and answer questions cancel their reservations. They will make themselves available, but not until they actually get to launch countdown. So, which means at least a month, hopefully just a month. But they're not, they're not going to do that travel. They obviously, again, they're 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 trying to cut out quote unquote unnecessary travel, and so I don't know that I necessarily would agree with that. Um, but I wouldn't have any problem with meeting people where they are instead of forcing them to come to a neutral site, so to speak. I'd be happy to go around to the centers, but unfortunately, I don't get the impression we get that opportunity exists either. So it's not just purely unfortunately, not just purely a financial consideration. Um, so yeah, we'll just again, we'll see. Um, I don't know what, maybe with the benefit of a little bit of time, people will get to we'll get a more of a we'll get more of a maybe we'll get an opportunity to ask specific follow-ups. Um, but I think, as I mentioned this morning, um, the count where the countdown clock stopped last night at T minus 5 minutes and 15 seconds. That was not a place I was aware of that it could stop, and so that's an obvious question. And so I will follow up on that. I'm not sure I have a huge amount of chance to talk to somebody about that before the launch, but I will probably um, request the subject matter expert for that to see if we can get an update on that, because it tells me there's still a gap in the information that's been shared so far about things like the terminal countdown. Um, so yeah, um, I don't have a good answer for when the second wet dress rehearsal will happen, because it's not really I, you know, I'm not the one who gets to choose. And so that was asked today in the briefing multiple times, or I think in multiple different ways. And I think really what they said was, give us a little bit of time, and they will they'll provide an update. So, but yeah, I don't know that there's any value in just making a guess without knowing what they're planning on doing, and they weren't ready to talk about schedules um, or sequences of uh, activities that they want to do. We have a vague idea about some of the things that they want to do before the launch windows open in March, but they weren't ready to talk about how they were going to sequence that, let alone when the next wet dress rehearsal will occur. So um, yeah, so we'll just have to see how things go. Um, but I mean, that's I think that's kind of where I am tonight. I haven't had a chance to rewatch and re-listen to everything that was said, and that's definitely worth doing. I'll absolutely need to do that. Maybe I'll get a chance to do that before the um, well, during the flight maybe. But yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about. I wouldn't worry too much about. I'm sure whatever EJ said wasn't a big deal. It was just, again, um, it's you just there are some of these shows have different audiences too, and so um, you know I think those guys, I think, like to keep things a little bit lighter. Obviously, saw the stuff with the store yesterday on the NSF stream when that came up, and so that's they're trying to keep things a little light, um, and I don't know that I have a problem with that. In fact, I like the fact uh, I get to be more serious over here, and I think you can watch both of those streams. So the there's time to do that. I don't know. To me, that was a good way of doing things yesterday. I do think uh, um, I don't if I'd had known that it was going to happen that way, I may have tried to stay on a little longer. Although again, to be honest, you could probably hear in the stream that I was frustrated uh, by how little they said. I think that was kind of the worst thing about the communications yesterday was, and I think the other problem with it is just I kind of, and I wouldn't have been the only one. I wasn't surprised that they clammed up, so to speak, when they had problems because they'd done that in the past. That's why that's why a lot of us that's one of the reasons why a lot of us had requested live commentary for this and a more detailed coverage of the wet dress rehearsal, is because um, you know I, we went sometimes went more than an hour between updates, and I just think in a way, um, there's probably some happy medium and some uh, reasons for not saying too much too quickly, but I think they're on the other end of the extreme, on the other end of the spectrum. I do think when things are going on, if you don't have an update, then you can explain. That's to me would be something else that you could do. You don't necessarily have to. You can talk about what's happening or what's happened. You don't necessarily have to say, you know. Um, but to me, saying nothing is is you know I don't know how else to put it. To me, I just think it's the worst choice, and that's just my opinion. Saying nothing is there's got to be a better choice than that. Um, to me, again, that's my opinion. So um, yeah, it was yeah. So there was it was again we were I think frustrated because we weren't. It's one of those situations where you're frustrated as expected. And again, I wish I could put it differently, but it is. We were sort of frustrated yesterday as expected. Um, so that's that's. But I think again, uh, nobody's going to remember this. I think unless again, unless we get to the next. We'll get to Artemis III and we have the same situation again. But um, it's really only people who are looking at this in depth. What most people remember about Artemis 1 right now is the mission itself. They obviously people are aware of the fact that it was several years late. You'll have the same people will still be aware of this for Artemis 2, but um, in a lot of ways, there's one what will happen to some degree is that it'll be okay. We got that done. Um, you move to the next mission. So um, but we're not there yet. So we'll just have to see what we'll have to see what happens with. We'll have to see what happens here, and I think that's there's going to be I think a little bit more. Um, well, it's going to be interesting, and that was another question. I think one of the questions that I had that I didn't ask was, are they going to send the closeout crew out there again? But the way they talked about it, so like what somebody asked, do you have to get down to T minus 33 seconds or T minus 30 seconds? Again, they're that distinct. That's an interesting distinction, but um, it was a good question. Do you have to get all the way down to that point um, to consider it a success? To consider the wet dress rehearsal a success, and Charlie's answer was also really interesting. Um, but I think she basically said something to the effect of yes, that they need to demonstrate that the vehicle, um, they would need to do that to demonstrate that the vehicle is, is meeting all of the launch commit criteria all the way up to the point where they stop the test. So, um, I think that is something that they want to see. Um, and so and I don't know if it was that question or another one or the combination of them, but it just gave me the impression, which would still want to confirm, but I got the impression that they're planning on doing something close to a carbon copy of the test plan that they had for Monday. And so I think they're probably going to send the closeout crew out there again. But again, maybe we will eventually find out if there are any changes in the test plan before they do the next or before they do the next one. I think so. Um, but yeah, so I think we're getting close to about an hour and a half. Um, I've probably done too much talking here and not taken enough questions. So if anybody has any more questions, let me know. Um, we'll hopefully get we'll have a much better understanding of this. I think hopefully by the end of the week, if not maybe this time next week, um, and understanding the time frame about when they're thinking about doing the next wet dress rehearsal. And in the meantime, there's now a little bit of time now to kind of take a step back and look at the broader picture from Artemis, and again start look and see if there are any things going on with Artemis 3. So we saw pictures. I think Reed Weissman posted a picture of the Mark One. Not he didn't see it, but he saw the container with it inside in Houston, and so it had arrived there, and probably sometime between that when that picture was posted and now it's going into the thermal vacuum chamber. But the I think the if I recall what they said about the Orion valve and venting that, um, that it sounds like the impact of doing that was just that they lost some time, so it took longer to do what they were there to do. It lengthened a segment of the closeout process. So that's obviously a lesson learned that they're probably going to need to be very um, I can't think of the word at the moment, but they're going to have to be very careful. Is not the careful is probably the wrong way of phrasing it, but something along those lines. Um, they're going to have to step through that very carefully and make sure that they just put some additional protections in the procedures to make sure that they don't do that, because you're one of the things they were trying to do last night was um, see how long it takes, and if they can do it a little faster than that, that's going to help overall, because it's sort of you're really all the preparations up until the point where you get to terminal count are you want to get you're trying to finish all of the tanking and Orion closeout preparations so that you're ready to begin terminal count at the very opening of the window. That's the ideal, and that's I think that would be something that they would be looking to do even for this. And so these tests would will that's a goal. It doesn't necessarily mean if they launch, then they launch, and that's the ultimate goal. But I think that's where you want to get to is you want to get to the point where when you're doing your countdowns that you're ready to fly at the when the launch window opens. Um, and so that's you don't the issue with the valve. It just makes it such that they're a little behind the timeline. So, but it didn't sound like it was it didn't sound like a showstopper. For instance, it sounded like they got everything done that they needed to get done, and it that they didn't talk about. Again, that was another one of those periods during the test last night where I was curious, because again when they left the pad, they got back to the roadblock um, much more quickly. So I remember I wasn't um, I wasn't on the live stream, but I was watching the live stream, the NSF live stream, and so saw them leaving the pad on the NSF live stream, and then I had to run down to my car, and by the time I got outside, they were, I didn't immediately jump up and go to my car, but like I saw the van coming back to driving past the press site exit and going over to, I assume, OSB2. That's because that's where they said that they were staging. Um, but they left the pad a lot more quickly than they um, than they got there when they were given the go to go out there. Um, So I think, but yeah, so let me, I'll hang around here for a little bit more if anybody has any other questions. Um, yeah, well, I mean, again, actually, I don't know if they cover the closeout crew van. When the crew, and I think we talked about that, I think last night. Um, the coverage for the launch will be full coverage from NASA, and so we'll see, they we were following, or we NSF was following the one of the helicopters that were supporting the test last night, and one of them is going to be escorting the convoy, or the convoy with the crew, and they practiced that timeline last night. But they also have a camera up there, and they have cameras all over the Launch Complex 39 area and the Kennedy Space Center, and they will follow the crew convoy from the ONC building all the way out to the pad. So we'll at least see that for sure. And if you had to guess, like if they have to pick between the closeout crew and the flight crew, they're going to go with the flight crew. And if you remember, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this, but when in the launch count, when they reach that point, and Charlie mentioned that today in terms of giving us a time tag for when all stages were in replenish, because that's the point where they would give the go the for both crews to go to the pad, and the closeout crew is starting from OSB2, which is again adjacent to the VAB, and the flight crew starting from the ONC building. So the closeout crew has about a 15-minute head start. And so if you have to choose between which one of them you're going to follow, you're probably going to follow the flight crew um, from the ONC building going up to the same location. But by the time they get there, the closeout crew should already be have got all of their equipment up the elevators and up to the 274-foot level, and sort of maybe parked around, in and around the White Room. So the um, so we will see we should see a lot more footage for launch day. I think it remains to be seen whether there are going to be any changes to the wet dress rehearsal. I suspect that's going to be something that I'm going to have to think about um, again, which is when they do the wet dress rehearsal, or whether I would come back out here just for that. So I don't know that that's. I think that the value proposition there is probably not probably about the same. So it is, if they had done this test on Saturday, I would have still been at home. I would have done the exact same thing that everybody else was doing this morning. Is I would have canceled my trip just to save the money. It would be great in a different world to be able to come out here every time, because it was valuable to be in the news center, because that we were able to see the countdown clock. But the question is, how valuable is that? I think it would be possible for me to do much of the same thing that I did yesterday by myself, and then also for NSF from home, just watching the streams. It's probably not the situation will probably not be will probably be somewhat different than what happened yesterday, in some way. Um, so we'll just have to see if there's some other reason or some other um, thing or opportunity that would come along with being here, and then going home and coming back again 2 weeks later or however long that is. Then I won't necessarily say no right away, but um, I think under all of the things considered, same situation, it'd be hard uh, to justify doing that trip, um, and not and getting that level of disclosure. I could I can do that for free at home. So we'll just have to see. Um, I thought I saw there was a question from Stephen. So can they simply stretch out the loading time? Um, I think I don't know that. Yeah, I'm not sure what the advantages would be of that, um, because um, and that was one of those questions that would have taken that would have been a multi-layered question to get to. But I think that again, I think I mentioned this in the stream in the morning, which was um, you could manage the flow rates for propellant loading and getting into stable replenish, and those are low flow rates. I don't think you have as much control over the flow rates during terminal count, that you're pressurizing the tanks. You have it isn't so much that you don't have control over those flow rates, but they have to be at a particular flow rate in order to satisfy all of the launch commit criteria. So it has to work during terminal count. Um, and I don't know that there's a lot of mitigations that they can do. So um, yeah, I mean, I think that I think again, if you were listening to the NSF stream, because that's when I found out that this had happened, that's why I was very pessimistic once we saw that they had to stop flow in the middle of loading. That the implications of that were not good for the rest of the night. So yeah, I don't know if I mean obviously if there's some um, benefit that outweighs the alternatives, then they I'm sure they would consider it if that really was something that would allow them to do that. I just think you're still going to end up in a situation where you're going to have to be able to stay within limits during terminal count. And so if they really were that close to um, they were close to the limit and went over it. And I think what Charlie said was they were fine until they got to fast fill. When they got to that flow rate, they just were having issues. And so um, I think they're going to have if it's possible that if they slowed down, it would take more time, and that maybe that's not there's nothing wrong with that, so to speak. But you would get up to those high flow rates again in terminal count. And so if the seal's going to leak when you get to a particular flow rate, then you're just it's not the way you want to be doing this, because you're taking that's a risk that you're sort of taking without having any control over it. So um, I think that's the problem with that. I do think um, well, I just think that that's the I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to be effective. Um, so yeah, the question when they cut it down to one reset instead of two, that's I mean they got the targeted T0 that they ended up with was I think it was 12:19 a.m. Eastern, and so the test window only went until 1 a.m. And so I think as we got closer and closer to we went past midnight without them picking up the clock, and I think a lot of people were starting to get nervous about would they even be able to do one terminal countdown run before the test window ended. And so yeah, that's I think um, and we never got a chance to ask them whether they anticipated that they were going to have an issue at that point in the countdown. Um, but I think if they weren't totally surprised that they saw this, given that they'd seen leaks earlier in the day, there probably wasn't a whole lot of value in in considering a second run, because they if they can't do one, they can't do two. So but we did not get it. We didn't. There wasn't enough time to ask that question today. So um, so they definitely ran out of time, but there may have been other reasons why they did that. And that was one thing she did mention that I thought was interesting was she said when they come back and try this again, they're going to come back and try and pick up those extra test objectives. And she ran through those, which was nice today. That recycle from one terminal count to another, the ability um, to be able to make another launch attempt or another terminal countdown attempt in the same 2 hour launch window is a could be a valuable capability to have. And so they want to demonstrate it with a flight vehicle, and better characterize the timeline and give them a much more precise. Well, that's not a good way of saying, but just to give them a much better idea about how long it takes, because that can fluctuate. There's probably a lot of variance in. But she also mentioned a couple of things that are good there. It's like you have, the tanks are pressurized. You're losing a little bit of propellants, and so you have to vent the tanks. You have to go back into topping and replenish, and then you have to do that for a certain amount of time. So that's another one of those operations that will take a little bit of time to get the propellant and get the engines back into a place that they need to be to do the second terminal count. And it's we didn't get a chance to ask if they had a guesstimate about how long that is, but I think we'd heard somewhere in the hour long ballpark. But when you're talking about a 2 hour window, um, even 10 minutes, so 70 minutes versus 60 minutes is a big deal. Just like, if it's 55 minutes, there's a big difference in a 2 hour long launch window if you can recycle in 55 minutes versus 75 minutes, for instance. So that's one of those things that they're going to try again to get those test objectives when they come back and do this again, whenever that is. So okay, and so I think I'm going to go ahead and call it a night. I have to get ready to get ready to go home, and then and sort of regroup. And that's we'll hang on to some questions here. Hopefully NASA will provide some of these answers before I do. Well, they have to, because I don't have any answers. I'm just reporting what they say. So, um, but we'll figure out exactly what we're going to do um, for the rest of the week, and then I think for the time being, we'll probably go back to more of a normal schedule, but we'll just have to see. Again, I don't know if we get to talk to anybody, or um, there will be briefings. But I do think when we get back to the next wet dress rehearsal test, it'll make sense to do something like that. And if I'm at home, there's some advantages to that, and just that I have a little bit more flexibility in terms of being able to go for a longer it's easier for me to just put up like a be right back sign on something, and uh and 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 take a little bio break or something like that. And so in the it was okay in the press room yesterday, but um it's just easier to take a short break and then and do a longer stream from home. But I also will try and figure out if there's a way to do. I hopefully will be a little bit better set up for that when we get to the next wet dress rehearsal. But so as we get close to that, it'll make sense to start doing some live streams again, and but I'll just play it by ear. If these are interesting to people, um, I'll try and find time to do them. Um, but I also want to do some of the videos because I do think there's value in both of those edited videos and these live streams. But we'll have now that we have a little bit more time to take a breath, we can do a little bit. I can take a look and see what's been going on, bigger picture with Artemis over the last couple of weeks. So, um, but I think, but for now, um, I'll hopefully I'll see you guys at the next live stream, and keep checking the channel for. I'll post updates as I hear things and what I'm thinking in terms of next whatever the next live stream or the next video is, and um, and hopefully we'll have something here at the end of the week, and hopefully we'll hear something from NASA about what they're thinking about the time frame for the next test and what they're doing between here and there. Um, but um, but again, thanks for thanks for being here. Thanks for letting me take some of your questions, and hopefully I'll see you again next time. Thanks.